Copyright disclaimer. Under Title 17 U.S.C. Section 107, allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, and research. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Non-profit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use. Okay, just to let you guys know, this one's going to take a while to read, and I want everyone to be aware that children go through this as well. Despite what a lot of the deluded, prestigious executives, former prestigious executives, and others want to say, want to live in denial land. So this is Scientology's Whole Track Security Check by Lily von Markob, dated September 28, 2008, still in use in 2024, especially on children. So I'm going to be reading on my tablet, so we might not be synced up. A Scientology security check, sec check, is a kind of interrogation that the big shots, prestigious executives of a Scientology org or security will give to a person when there is a chance he or she may have been exposed to something that conflicts with official Scientology doctrine. As you may imagine, this happens constantly, as Scientology doctrine conflicts with nearly all of science, medicine, history, ethical, business practice, and more. For example, if a Scientologist staff member reads a website critical of the cult and then reports this to the org, which Scientologists are required to do, in which they always do they now? The leaders will insist upon giving a sec check. It's always so ambiguous, isn't it? The interrogations are grueling and silly. Are they silly? There are sec checks for all occasions. And there is even a rather disturbing sec check for children. You already read that one. Should be CC'd to the president and a whole bunch of other people. Sometimes the interrogators will gang up on the victim. Sometimes. Please go and read Jenna Miscavige's book, Beyond Belief. An event known as Gangbang Sec Check. Isn't that great, you guys? You guys know what else that means, right? I personally don't think it was just LRH writing this. Read between the lines. Here is an example of something called a whole track sec check. As always, the victim is hooked up to the e-meter, a primitive lie detector, and interrogated for hours with the following insane questions. And by the way, you guys, this is very telling. Very, very telling. You need to read between the lines on these questions. They always hide in plain sight. They always do. Whole track sec check. Have you ever enslaved a population? Remember, hidden in plain sight. Have you ever implanted anyone? Have you ever sacked a city? Have you ever sunk or otherwise destroyed a non-combatant vessel? Have you ever abused hostages or prisoners? Have you ever ordered or yourself committed genocide? Have you ever annihilated a population? Have you ever poisoned food or drinking supplies? They're telling you what they really do, you guys. Have you ever strangled anyone? Have you ever deliberately spread disease? Have you ever degraded a religion? Have you ever harmed a child of either sex? Have you ever warped an educational system? Thinking of the Rothschilds? Have you ever deprived people of hope? Look at the last 4 years, you guys. Have you ever committed murder? Have you ever destroyed a culture? Have you ever forced anyone into an undesired beingness? Have you ever stolen a body from another being? Have you ever destroyed an economy? Is anybody seeking to discover your whereabouts? See how asinine these questions are? Hidden in plain sight. Have you ever violated a nation's neutrality? Have you ever broken a treaty? Have you ever blanketed bodies for the sensation kick? Have you ever upset an ecology? Have you persecuted others for their religious or political beliefs? Have you interfered with the free flow of trade? Have you ever been a crook? Have you ever obliterated a language? Native Americans come to mind? Irish? Have you ever stumped out a religion? Have you ever deliberately trained people in untruths for power or profit? Have you ever defiled religious places, persons, or objects? Have you ever practiced terrorism? Have you ever done anything you would not like to think of yourself as having done? Have you ever been a coward? This is to entrain the mind, you guys. Puts people in a hypnotic state. Have you ever trapped a Thetan? Have you ever prided yourself on your wickedness? Like Aleister Crowley? Have you ever destroyed artistic productions or creations? Have you burned literature? Have you ever forbidden people to practice their own customs? Have you ever perverted a people's customs? Have you ever done anything which you hoped would be wiped out by the passage of time? Do you deserve to be punished into eternity for something you've done? If so, what is it? Have you ever exposed infants? Have you ever exposed infants? Have you ever bred bodies for degrading purposes? Is there anything you would have done differently if you had more data? Have you ever forced beings into unwanted bodies? Have you deliberately prevented beings from exteriorizing? Have you done anything to a person, group, or thing that wasn't deserved? Have you ever deserted a just cause? Have you ever debased a nation's currency? Have you ever deliberately tortured someone? Have you ever enslaved another being? Have you ever gained or maintained a position by portraying yourself as victimized? Have you ever undermined a people's trust? Have you driven anyone insane? Have you ever been a professional prostitute? Have you ever been a criminal? Have you ever trained people for criminal purposes? Have you ever been a pervert? Have you ever recruited anyone for an unworthy purpose? Have you ever traded in others' bodies for profit or power? Have you ever stolen a mock-up or facsimile? Have you ever usurped a location? Have you ever made things scarce so that you might profit unfairly? Like a food shortage? Have you ever made a practice of creating emergencies? Have you ever practiced human sacrifice? Have you ever assumed a beingness which was not rightfully yours? Have you ever killed the wrong person? Have you ever punished an innocent person? Is anybody looking for you? Have you ever systematically degraded an individual or population or mock-up? Have you ever unlawfully or unethically deserted a post? Have you betrayed someone or something which deserved your help? Have you ever set a poor example? Have you ever perverted the institutions of a culture for your own personal power or profit? Have you ever denied yourself? Have you ever betrayed yourself? Did you come to earth for evil purposes? Have you ever acted contrary to your own principles? Have you ever failed a friend? Have you ever sought to render others dependent on you? Have you ever abused those under your protection? Have you ever destroyed farmland, crops, or breeding stock? Have you ever despoiled a planet of its natural resources? Are you in hiding? Have you ever made a planet or nation radioactive? Have you ever wrecked a climate? Have you ever systematically set up mysteries? Have you ever made nothing of yourself? Have you made a profession of destruction? Have you ever enturbulated an orderly environment? Have you ever been a traitor? Have you ever deliberately lowered another's knowingness or ability? Have you ever maimed and crippled other people's bodies? Have you ever pretended to a power you did not possess? Have you ever stolen ships, draft vessels, or vehicles belonging to a government? Have you ever disappeared? Have you ever killed your own body? Have you ever pretended to a knowingness you did not possess? Have you ever caused a planet to disappear? Have you ever felt the ends justified the means? Have you ever given cause a bad name? Have you ever discredited the creations of others? Have you ever been off post at a time when you were desperately needed? Have you ever convinced another that he has mocked up an unconfrontability? Have you ever deliberately mocked up an unconfrontability? Have you ever made a practice of confusing people? Have you perverted historical truths for any reason? Have you ever deliberately sent someone to the wrong place or the wrong person? Have you ever been a professional spy or intelligence agent? Have you made a practice of worrying people? Have you consistently practiced sex in some unnatural fashion? Have you demonstrated that control is impossible? Have you ever wrecked a vehicle or vessel? Have you ever pretended to be dead? What questions should be on this check for others? Have you ever convinced another of the injustice of his cause? That sounds familiar. Have you ever philosophized when you should have acted instead? Have you ever claimed it harmed you to do something? Have you ever deliberately disfigured another's body? Have you ever torn out someone's tongue? That's a Freemasonic reference. Have you ever blinded anyone? Have you ever destroyed another's hearing? Have you ever knocked someone's teeth out? Have you ever punished another by cutting off some part of his body? They do that in the mob and the mafia. Have you ever been a parasite? Is there anything you have sworn off being? Is there anything you have sworn off doing? Is there anything you have sworn off having? Have you ever given a degraded or debased example of divinity? Have you ever perverted a communication system? Have you ever been a professional critic? Have you ever held others in pawn for profit? Have you ever presumed on the natural goodness of another? Have you ever caused another to mistrust you? Have you ever made a burden of yourself? Have you ever gone crazy? Have you ever sought to persuade another of your insanity? Have you ever deliberately mutilated bodies? You guys know where that comes from. Have you ever deliberately mutilated objects? Have you heightened SEXUL, sensation by inflicting pain? Have you ever caused something to appear at an unexpected time? Have you ever caused something to appear in an unexpected place? Have you ever maltreated a pregnant woman or pregnant animal? Have you ever corrupted a child? Have you ever sought to convince others of their guilt? Have you ever started a war? Have you ever caused your own side to lose? Have you ever deliberately distorted others' ideas? Have you ever manipulated beings as though they were messed? That's material, ether, space-time. Have you ever deserted or betrayed a great leader? Have you ever sought to convince beings that they were messed? Have you ever tried to persuade others there were thoughts they mustn't think? Have you ever sought to put another's thinkingness out of his control? Have you ever permitted a subordinate of yours to be punished for your mistakes? Have you ever tried to shift blame onto a superior of yours? Have you ever smothered a baby? Have you ever inflicted physical pain on an insane person for any reason? Have you ever taken pride in and cultivated a wrongness? Have you ever worshipped wrongness in others? Have you ever sought to make others unwilling to produce? Produce. Have you ever wiped out a family? Have you ever rewarded another or a group for a wrongness? Have you ever had sexual relations with an animal or bird? Have you ever participated in a sexual relationship between a doll body and a human body? Have you ever destroyed a doll body? Have you ever lost a doll body entrusted to you? Have you ever punished another or group for a rightness? Have you ever permitted another to be punished for your misdeed? Have you ever perpetuated an injustice? Have you ever been brutal to animals? Have you ever denied others a means of existence? Have you deserted your own children? Have you ever deserted your own children? Have you ever refused to support your parents or grandparents? Have you ever denied others a redressment of grievances? Have you ever caused another to distrust himself? Have you ever caused another to identify himself with a form in order to enslave him? Like I said, you guys, hidden in plain sight. Have you ever given anyone the third degree? Have you ever validated the insanity of another being or group? Have you ever tried to give sanity a bad name? Have you ever warped or distorted bodies for sexual purposes? Have you ever wanted to disown a deed of yours? Do you deserve to have any friends? Have you ever castrated anyone? Have you ever wrongfully claimed another's deed as your own? Have you ever robbed a dead body? This is sick. Have you ever made love to a dead body? Isn't that a great way to word it, you guys? It's not sick. What is it called? Necromancy? Sick. Do you deserve to be free? Do you deserve to be enslaved? Is there any question on this check I had better not ask you again? Have you ever considered another didn't deserve to be sane? Have you ever considered another didn't deserve to be free? See what they're doing, you guys? Have you ever considered another didn't deserve to be well? Have you ever considered another didn't deserve to be alive? Have you ever made MEST, matter, ether, space-time, guilty of harming you? Have you ever made another guilty of doing you permanent harm? Have you ever forced another to compete? Have you ever pretended to be unable to repair a form? Have you ever refused to put back into order a disorder you created? Have you ever shot or stabbed someone in the back? Have you ever been disloyal? Have you ever been treacherous? Have you ever engaged in piracy? Have you ever made an outrageous or preposterous will? Have you ever thrown the ownership of property into doubt? Have you ever demonstrated that communication is impossible? Have you ever withheld useful data? Have you ever created chaos? You know, that's order ab chao, right? Order out of chaos. Chaos magic. Have you ever consistently made a practice of furnishing useless data? Have you ever tried to make the physical universe less real? Have you ever caused another to mistrust his judgment? Have you ever convinced another he was guilty of a crime or misdeed which he had not in fact committed? Have you ever sought to convince another that there was something wrong with him? Have you ever practiced medicine unethically? Have you ever practiced law or jurisprudence unethically? Have you ever sought to convince another that everything was the same as everything else, so it didn't matter what he did? Have you ever spread despair? Have you ever kept effective solutions from working? Have you ever sought to convince another that there was no difference between right and wrong? Have you ever been a pimp? Have you ever given families a bad name? Have you ever produced a criminal? Have you ever assisted an evildoer? Have you ever driven a population into criminality? Have you ever used criminality as a means of control of a population? Have you ever made sanity appear to be psychotic? It's an inversion. Have you ever been a psychiatrist? Have you ever depopulated an area? Have you ever deprived another of a livelihood? Have you ever given a God a bad name? Have you ever been a corrupt priest? Have you ever given spirits an evil reputation? Have you ever been an evil spirit? Have you ever sought to convince others that things were evil? Have you ever taught others that nothing can be done? Have you ever tried to convince others that knowing is bad, that perceiving is bad, that sensation is bad? Have you ever deliberately caused a sane person to be committed to a mental institution? Have you ever performed unnecessary surgery on someone's body? Have you ever tried to convince others that things are bad, that there are bad beingness, that it is bad to do things? Have you ever mocked another's ability? Have you ever mocked another's knowingness? Have you ever mocked another's creativeness? Have you ever applied a hot iron to another person's body? Have you ever tortured another with electrical or electronic devices? You guys should know where that comes from. Have you ever attacked others for causing effects that you secretly knew were beneficial or helpful? Have you ever deliberately caused others to feel less responsible? Have you ever beaten a child to death? Have you ever starved anyone to death? Have you ever left anyone to die of thirst? Have you ever misestimated an effort? Have you ever misjudged another? Have you ever failed to save someone from drowning? Have you ever knowingly sponsored a swindle? Have you ever failed another? Have you ever wasted time when you ought not to have? Have you ever retreated from an area where you should have stayed or advanced? Have you ever wasted men, women, children, objects, an ability, animals, thoughts, spaces, energy? Have you ever made nothing of a worthy person, of a group, of a universe, of a spirit? Have you failed in any way to live up to your own ideas of how you should be? Have you ever broken someone's body on a wheel? Have you ever stretched another's body on a rack? You guys should know where this stuff's coming from. Have you ever put a criminal in a position of trust? Have you ever sold people on the idea that people are basically wicked? Have you ever boiled someone's living body in oil? Have you ever eaten a human body? I mean, come on, you guys. But if anybody talks about these things, they're a conspiracy theorist, right? Have you ever eaten the body of a member of your own species? Have you ever disfigured a beautiful thing? Have you ever exterminated a species? Have you ever let your past triumphs discourage you about your future? Have you ever flayed anyone alive? Have you ever been a professional executioner? Have you ever done a bad thing to win approval? Have you ever been a dishonest policeman? Have you ever been a brutal gaoler? Have you ever been a corrupt judge? Have you ever been a bad soldier? Have you ever done a bad thing to save yourself? Have you ever done a bad thing to save another? Have you ever been an ungrateful child? Have you ever been a wicked mother? Have you ever been a bad father? Have you ever convinced another that his goals were no good? Have you ever been an abortionist? Have you ever run a brothel? Have you ever had a body with a venereal disease? If so, did you spread it? Have you ever produced a bastard? Have you ever convinced another that he shouldn't confront someone or something? Have you ever failed to send or deliver a vital message? Have you committed RAPE? Have you employed poison gas against life forms? Have you ever put up a creditable creation? Have you ever taught that it was bad for people to have things? Have you ever deliberately infected life forms with disease? Interesting. Have you ever made a body disappear? Have you ever consistently made a practice of attacking people who helped you? Have you ever perverted an ethic? Have you ever consistently made a practice of attacking those who helped others? Have you ever abused or tortured life forms? Have you ever inflicted an unwarranted punishment? Have you ever enforced breeding? Breeding. Have you ever desecrated burial places? Have you ever attacked helpless persons? Have you ever denied anyone a desired beingness? Have you ever caused another being to create against his own wishes or interests? Have you ever zapped anyone? Have you deliberately set property afire? Have you ever created an effect for which there was no apparent cause? Have you ever interiorized a being into a machine? Have you ever forced a body to survive against its owner's wishes? Have you ever arrested the development of a culture? Is there any place you'd better not return to? Is there anything the people of Earth had better not find out about you? Is there any time you'd better not return to? Have you done anything that had better not happen again? Have you ever given creativeness a bad name? Have you given biological bodies a bad name? Have you given doll bodies a bad name? Have you given robots a bad name? What should others be warned about concerning you? What don't you trust yourself with? Is there anything you can't forgive yourself for? Is there anything others should not forgive you for? Have you ever caused equipment entrusted to your care to vanish? Have you ever acted as a double agent? Have you ever misappropriated equipment entrusted to your care? Have you ever interrogated another under torture? Have you ever caused anyone to be burned alive? Have you ever misappropriated funds entrusted to your care? Have you ever violated the sanctity of a herald? Have you ever violated a flag of truce or a period of truce? Have you ever caused someone to be flogged to death? Have you ever been a religious fanatic? Have you ever assassinated a prominent person? Have you ever blown anything up? Have you ever violated a sanctuary? Have you ever poisoned an atmosphere? Have you ever set a booby trap? Have you ever violated the established rules of warfare? Have you ever made yourself out to be weaker than you in fact were? Have you ever made yourself out to be stronger than you in fact were? Have you ever promised help without intending to give it? Have you ever abandoned your sick or dead to the enemy? Have you ever failed to rescue your leader?